Hello, welcome back to Memory Medicine. I'm Dr. Nina Lewis-Larson, and today I'm here to talk to you about the APOE4 gene. This is a really common question I get in my clinic regarding if it's worth knowing your APOE4 status, meaning, is it a good idea to get genetic testing? What I often tell people is it's very much an individual decision. It's very beneficial for some people, but can be detrimental for others. And a lot of this has to do with your own personal health journey, your own status of anxiety. I find people that tend to be very anxious, worried, easily stressed, not always a good idea to find out about genetics because it's easy to hyper-focus on the what ifs or what could happen or worrying all the time, is that going to happen to me? I tell people that a gene is like a light switch on a wall. It is there, but it can be turned on or off. So deciding whether or not to get your APOE or other genes tested really has to do with, are you feeling comfortable with being able to handle that information, knowing that you do have some input, but certainly it can be a wake-up call for some individuals. So let's look at this APOE4 gene and what it's all about. So essentially the primary role of APOE4 is to carry around fat. It goes into the nucleus of your cell and it actually binds about 1,700 different genes. So it can change many different aspects of your network of information inside your cell. For those individuals who carry no copies of APOE4, your lifetime risk of developing Alzheimer's disease is about 9%. If an individual carries one copy of the APOE4 gene, your risk increases to about 30%, so it's quite significant. The biggest concern comes with individuals who are what we call APOE4 homozygous, meaning that they carry two copies of the APOE4 gene. This unfortunately increases your risk by around 90% through your lifetime of developing Alzheimer's disease. So the advantage of knowing if, for example, you are a carrier of one or two of these genes, is that you can do something about this early. And the data does show that Alzheimer's disease changes happen likely 15 or more years before we see any symptoms. So if you know early on, say in your 20s or 30s, you're a carrier of these genes, maybe it would be a little motivation to really focus on diet and lifestyle and a few other interventions I'll mention today to try and mitigate and reduce your risk of developing this nasty disease. Okay, so let's just do a brief overview of genes. It's probably been a long time since anybody has sat in a genetics class. So if it hasn't been a long time for you, you can skip through this part of the video. But just a brief overview, each human cell contains the instructions needed to do its job. These instructions are made of DNA, and it's packed tightly around chromosomes. Each chromosome has thousands of segments of genes. Genes come from your parents, so they carry information such as eye color, for example, your height, and your predisposition to disease. Each person inherits a gene from each parent. The problem with genes is that even a small change can increase your risk to certain diseases. APOE comes in 3 different forms. And again, you get one copy from mom, one copy from dad. APOE2 is relatively rare and seems to be a bit protective against disease, at least in our medical literature knowledge to this point. APOE3 is the most common and plays kind of a neutral role in the disease. It's really not good, not bad. You kind of have the average, that 9% lifetime risk of developing Alzheimer's. APOE4, as I mentioned earlier, does have that increased risk of developing Alzheimer's. We think about 25% of people carry one copy of APOE4 and about 3-ish% of people carry two copies. Again, I want to reiterate that just because you carry an APOE gene does not mean you will definitely develop Alzheimer's. So this is something to keep in mind as you make these decisions about whether or not to get tested. And on the other side, we do see people develop Alzheimer's that have 0 copies of APOE genes as well. So it's not a guaranteed endpoint if you have or don't have this disease. I want to back up to and just talk about the difference here. I am talking about a late onset Alzheimer's. When we're talking about early onset Alzheimer's, which is a devastating disease, pretty rare, about 8 to 10% of all people with Alzheimer's, that happens early in life. So somewhere between 30s and 60s. This is not so much associated with APOE4, but more so with 2 other genes, presenilin 1 and 2, and amyloid precursor protein on chromosome 21. So I just wanted to separate out exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not, APOE is more about that late onset or sort of more classical Alzheimer's disease. So many people want to know, what is the point of APOE? Why do I need it if it predisposes me to different medical concerns? And so what I will say is that there's actually a benefit under certain circumstances for having APOE gene. So under conditions of high infection, eating certain foods, or generally having a shorter lifespan, APOE4 can be adaptive and protective. For example, we know that impoverished children living in the slums have actually a higher protective response to parasite infections if they have APOE4. So it's actually a gene that, if you live in high infection conditions, can protect you. So it comes to a challenge when a person carries APOE4 and they live a longer lifespan. It does seem to increase the risk of more age-related diseases, particularly impacting arteries and the brain. APOE4 have been associated with many different diseases, not just Alzheimer's, mostly cardiovascular disease, stroke, Parkinson's, Lewy body dementia, MS, among a few others. So it isn't just a gene related to Alzheimer's disease, but again, other chronic diseases known to show up a little later in life. So going back to what's the purpose, APOE4, it binds lipids. It moves lipid molecules around your body, essentially. So APOE4 has a higher propensity to bind lipids than, say, APOE3 does. So what this can cause is increased affinity and reduced recycling. So we can have more fatty acid oxidation, more accumulation of fatty acids in the blood vessels, which of course can clog up blood vessels in both the body and the brain. APOE4 carriers typically display both high triglycerides and high cholesterol. Versus APOE2, I mentioned, is more protective. Those individuals tend to have a lower LDL cholesterol. We also see that APOE4 can be responsible for those individuals who are thin, but still expressing traits of metabolic syndrome. So individuals that look thin, but are showing signs of diabetes, high cholesterol, high triglycerides, cardiovascular disease, despite not being the classic concerns with obesity. The other thing is that those that carry APOE4 tend to oxidize polyunsaturated fatty acids quicker than those that don't carry APOE4. They also tend to have lower DHA content in their brain. So we know that individuals who have APOE4 do need to be cautious in their diet and lifestyle intake. Ideally, if you find out you have APOE4 early in life, you would start taking things like DHA. You would make sure you avoid foods high in polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs for short. You would want to do more fasting to give the body time to clear up these lipoproteins. So these would be interventions that you could do early on to try and mitigate some of the risk that this APOE4 gene carries. We know that if you are overweight or obese earlier on in your life, say below your 60s, this can be more of a negative impact on your cognitive function later in life than if you're obese later in life. Those individuals with APOE4 actually seem to have a bit of protective benefit from carrying a little extra weight in their later years, but a little bit more detrimental impact of carrying extra weight in their earlier years. We believe this is because of the lack of omega oils in the brain with APOE4 carriers, that the body actually likes a little bit of extra fat in the system as we all age. So there is a little advantage to the APOE4 carriers not being too thin in later years of life. We also know that APOE4 is inflammatory. So we know it increases things called interleukins, tumor necrosis factor, seems to have a higher increased response to LPS or lipopolysaccharide, meaning that we really need to make sure individuals who are APOE4 carriers are not harboring chronic infection status inside of their digestive tract. We really need to pay attention to anything that could be triggering an inflammatory response from the gut. We know that APOE4, again, I mentioned ancestrally was beneficial to pathogens, to infections, more resistant to chronic diarrhea and young kids living in the slums, for example. So there's a survival advantage to it in certain situations. However, as we age, again, increasing LDL, increasing atherosclerosis, decreasing vascular blood flow, it does have quite a few negative consequences long term. There's also evidence that APOE4 carriers can have increased blood-brain barrier breakdown. So we all have a protective layer between our digestive tract and our internal body. We have that same protective layer between our bodies and our brains. And there is some modeling, mostly mice studies, but it does show that people with APOE4 have activation of MMP9, which is a pathway that can degrade the blood-brain barrier tight junction. So kind of opening those junctions up for different neurotoxic factors to invade into the brain. So we also want to make sure we do everything we can to protect the blood-brain barrier in these individuals. We look at some very interesting studies when we're studying APOE4 carriers, and it's very interesting to even note there are some studies looking at pediatrics, some imaging and neurocognitive studies on pediatric patients showing that children who carry APOE4 had thinner temporal cortex and smaller hippocampal regions when studied. They also had weaker executive function abilities. So these would be a time where if we knew this information early on, we could hopefully put in some interventions early on in childhood through our years to try and change the trajectory of cognitive decline in the future. So again, these are the advantages of knowing these things early on. We know, as I mentioned, that the APOE4, glucose hypometabolism is a piece here. So we want to ask a person with APOE4 gene as early as possible to be very cognizant of not allowing themselves to be prediabetes, diabetes, or even just generally intaking a lot of sugar. We want to intake a lot of healthy fats, particularly fats high in omega-3 and DHA, but avoiding those polyunsaturated fatty acids. We want to try and encourage intermittent fasting. And we want to have a diet moderate in fat intake, maybe around 50%, but we want to be cautious with doing higher fat intakes like things like a ketogenic diet with those who have APOE4, especially if you're homozygous or carrying 2 copies. So I hope this information was helpful for you today. Again, it's a very individual decision on if you decide to get genetic testing done. But if you feel that it wouldn't be too overwhelming to anxiety or stress, I do believe there's a lot of advantage for knowing your APOE4 status early on in life so that you can really focus on areas we know can be preventative at the genetic implications of carrying these genes. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.